Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we have a screencast on Warren G. Harding and his times, or should I say President Warren G. Harding. Now, he was president from 1921 to 1923, which is kind of a weird crop of numbers, but we're going to get to why that's weird. He was the 29th president of the United States, and let's kind of look at the past before him. Now, before Harding, William McKinley was president of the United States for about 5 years, but he was assassinated by an anarchist. Teddy Roosevelt took over for 7 years. And then, of course, William H. Taft took over when Roosevelt didn't want to be president anymore. Now, both Teddy Roosevelt and Taft are going to fight in the election of 1912, but they're going to split the Republican Party, leading to Democrat Woodrow Wilson being elected in 1912. He's going to serve 2 terms, or 8 years, and he's going to win World War I in the process. But that would be the end of the Democrats' reign, at least temporarily. Presidents of the 1920s were all Republicans, and the first of those 3 Republicans would be Warren G. Harding, President Harding. Now, he was from the great state of Ohio. Now, Ohio has had more presidents than any other state. Now, as you can see on this little map, it shows where presidents were from. And, of course, Ohio has a lot of dots. Now, it's tied for first. Now, this says 7 and 7. There are some disputes about presidents. Do you count them just because they were born in a state, or did they have to live there, or did they have to live there right before the election? Either way, by some measure, New York and Ohio currently are leading the way with providing our country presidents. So what was the party of Harding from Ohio? And that would be the Republican Party, of course. If he had been a Democrat, I would have showed a donkey being the symbolic animal of choice. So let's tell Harding's story and see how effective of a president he was. Well, in 1919, Teddy Roosevelt was the king of the Republicans, and by that I mean most popular, earning the most respect. But he died in 1921, and that is going to leave an empty throne for the Republicans. Now, who is going to fill that vacuum of power? And the answer is going to be Warren G. Harding, pretty much by compromise. During that presidential convention, the Republican convention, nobody could agree on who should take over the mantle of the leadership. So Harding was the least offensive to most and the compromised candidate. So in the 1920 election, Warren G. Harding will be elected, or should I say nominated by the Republicans, and he's going to go up against the Democratic nominated James Cox. Now, the number one election in the number one issue in the 1920 presidential election was the League of Nations. The U.S. was still in the midst of trying to determine whether we should join the League of Nations and sign the Treaty of Versailles. Harding was against it. Typical argument of the irreconcilable, saying, no, this will drag us into war. He wanted to be an isolationist. James Cox basically agreed with Wilson and said, hey, if we join the League of Nations, then we won't have any more wars. We can work together as a world to stop war. So either way, we know ultimately the U.S. is going to side with the Republicans, Harding, and against Wilson and Cox, and not join the League of Nations. But another election issue is, what should the role of government be? Our country was really debating, what is the job of the government? Should government be super powerful, or should it not be? More weak, kind of like that guy. Now, that said, the Democrats said government should be powerful. They basically followed the progressive perspective, or the progressive philosophy, that many people in our society need protection, whether it's children, women, African Americans, so many others. Our government needs to be powerful and active to protect them. The Republicans at this time in the 1920s instead looked at government in more of a fearful way. And by fearful, basically the government would be watching us, and in return we need to watch and guard against them. Government can't be strong. If it's strong, it takes away our freedom. Government passes laws that restrict freedom, and we don't want a big, powerful government passing lots of laws, according to the Republicans and Harding. So in the 1920 election, Harding was, hey, let's bring laissez-faire back. The government should mind its own business. Cox basically said, no, the government needs to protect the people from themselves. We need laws protecting the meek, the susceptible, the weak from being exploited by the rich and powerful. Now, is Harding going to win that argument? He did have a good slogan. His slogan was, we need to return to normalcy. Normalcy, it wasn't actually even a word in the dictionary at this time. Harding at times was considered very pompous and trying to come up with all these big words that people didn't know, trying to sound smart. But either way, Harding said we need to return to normal times, normalcy. No more war, no more progressive protests, no more new laws. Let's just stop whining and go back to the good old days where we can just relax and revel in our power. Now, Harding did have some other advantages rather than just fleeing for normalcy. He spent 4 times the amount of money as Cox did. They raised a lot of money, which the party out of power often can do. Number 2, Woodrow Wilson, the leader of the Democrats at the time, was sick with his stroke and very inactive. People could not hear from him. And whenever your coach or captain is off the field, a lot of times that team suffers. And the Democrats certainly did suffer without their leader. Number 3, in elections, people generally the American people tend to desire change. So the Democrats were in power for 8 years with Wilson. That led to a lot of complaints that, of course, could be blamed on the party in power, which happened to be the Democrats. So people tend to just want change, and change would be to vote for the Republicans. So in 1920, the Republicans win, and they win by a landslide, meaning, of course, they won by a lot. 60.3% went to the Republicans. Now, that is an electoral college victory that was huge, and actually the biggest victory in the electoral college in popular vote since 1820. That's 100 years. That means Warren G. Harding is a huge winner. And again, winner, winner, chicken dinner. Harding must be amazing if he's going to win by that much. So let's check out what his accomplishments were. Now, Harding, policy number 1, has to do with laissez-faire economics, that philosophy. Once again, this was something we talked about during the campaign, but now that Harding's in power, he has some power to determine what the role of government is. And the big debate was progressivism versus laissez-faire. Progressivism had dominated the last 20 years. Roosevelt was a progressive, Taft was a progressive, Wilson was a progressive, even though he was in a different party. Now, the progressives believe that the government's job is to be a referee, basically to protect people that need protecting, to watch Americans, to protect Americans from other Americans. Now, progressives would say life is generally unfair, and it's the job of the government to fix that by punishing Americans that bully everybody else. Now, also maybe restricting businesses that might want to exploit the poor or their workers. That often comes in the form of red tape or laws or regulations telling businesses what they can and can't do. Now, examples of that would be regulating monopolies, stopping mergers, adding laws to protect workers, like minimum wage, safe equipment in factories, environmental restrictions. Now, in 1921, Harding is now in charge, not the progressives or their agenda. He was more of a laissez-faire president. He believed the government should keep their hands off the economy. Let businesses handle themselves. So if you have a problem, you know what? It's on you. It's your responsibility. Nobody else is to handle that problem. Stop relying on the government. So during Harding's tenure, the government starts to trend towards getting smaller, less laws, less regulation. Businesses, no, we're not going to hold you back. You can prosper with your freedom. So that's kind of that laissez-faire philosophy that Harding's going to start, and his successor presidents, whether it being Hoover or Coolidge, are also going to follow. Now, why is laissez-faire good? Well, from a certain perspective, if you have smaller government with less regulations, it has a smaller budget, and therefore lower taxes are needed. There is a but, though. Of course, progressives' point of view is that laissez-faire is bad because life needs a referee. We talked about this before. The government has to fight for equity. That basically, here we go, this classic equity image showing that if you look at the boxes that each of them are standing on, if everybody is just left to their own devices, if everybody has to battle for themselves, even if they have achieved equality, that isn't necessarily fair. As you can see, these 3 gentlemen, one has the same as everybody else, but can't actually watch the game. That's not entirely fair. Equity would be more like everybody getting what they need to achieve equality, and progressives would say it's the government's job to do this. You could make a case that somebody who believes in laissez-faire says, no, everybody should be on their own and strive for equality. So 2 different kind of philosophies there. So either way, this begs the question, how would you vote in future elections? There's always going to be one candidate that respects laissez-faire more than others, and there's going to be one candidate that wants the government to be more active and more regulating. And we're going to talk about what the merits of low regulation are as this progresses, this presentation. So Harding and the Republican Party in the 1920s fully embraced laissez-faire economics, kind of undoing some progressive goals and whatnot. Another aspect of the Harding presidency would be he supported isolationism. Now, Americans did regret highly World War I. Now, that was a huge regret. It had such high, for all countries of the world, but including the United States, there were such high casualties and death among our soldiers. And of course, it had high costs. So Americans regretted that war. All they could think about was how we can, I wish we could go back in time and not join it. Certainly never again we're going to join a war like that. So what was the solution? Americans and Harding and the Republican Party said isolationism. As much as possible, let's stay away from the rest of the world. Let's avoid treaties that can get us sucked into the wars. Let's avoid that League of Nations, which Wilson created. Let's stop getting entangled with foreign governments. Now, that is great. Isolationism sounds great because, of course, it saves money and saves lives and stops us from getting sucked into wars. But what's bad about isolationism? Well, I think this would actually play out in the early 1930s as the U.S. was all in for isolationism. Imagine a full complement of countries, and imagine Hitler rises up in a future Germany. If he attacks one country, all these countries could help out and even defeat Hitler, but instead they say, no, we're going to mind our own business. We're going to stay isolated. And then what does Hitler do? He takes out another country. Now, it could have been 4-1, but they stayed isolated. And ultimately, over the course of time, this evil, aggressive country is becoming more and more powerful as they conquer and defeat countries and gains their resources. And now it's 1-on-1 with the United States. It could have been 5 versus 1, 6 versus 1. But the U.S. during that entire time embraced isolationism, and now is in trouble. And that is exactly what's going to happen. World War II is going to be a terrible war, in part because many of the countries are going to be conquered that could have helped out in defeating the enemies. Now, isolationism problem 2 is when you ignore problems, problems tend to get larger. And that's, again, applicable to what we first talked about. Certainly, Germany became a bigger problem as we ignored it. Now, World War II is this example we've talked about. If you look at this image, all of that was conquered by the Axis powers before the United States joined the war. Can you imagine that? The United States watched each of these countries lose their freedom, and still we were not motivated to get involved. That is true hardcore isolationism, which can be very dangerous. Now, every election, one candidate is more isolationist than the other, wants the United States to focus more on themselves domestically than be involved with world affairs. This doesn't really describe the United States too much after World War II, but there's always a candidate that's more isolationist, and I think you have to develop a philosophy. Do you believe more in isolationism or less? Isolationism certainly has its benefit. Again, lots of lives, lots of money, solve your own problems versus the world's. But we've also seen some of its deficits, right? So Harding embraced isolationism, and he embraced laissez-faire economics, basically smaller government staying out of the economy. Now, here's one exception to the role of isolationism: the Washington Naval Conference. Now, one of the huge lessons of World War I was that weapons tend to lead to militarism, arms races, and of course, more weapons and more likely to bring you to war. When countries are armed, they're apt to want to fight because they're capable of fighting. So in 1921, I think we've learned some lessons from World War I. Hopefully, we learned from our past and our history. And we noticed something bad was happening, that Japan was growing strong, specifically their Navy. And of course, that made the U.S. nervous. It also made Britain nervous. And the solution that the world and Americans called for, and certainly Harding and Wilson, was we need to protect ourselves. So what we need to do is we need to build a large Navy to meet Japan's, right? We need more weapons. But again, we learned that lesson from World War I, that if we do that, then Japan will grow their Navy stronger, and then we will grow ours, and that will lead to war. We need to avoid this arms race by having a smaller military, because we don't want this to happen again, right? World War I happened again. So to stop this problem, our new solution in 1921 was we invited all the major military powers to come to Washington, D.C., specifically Britain and Japan. And this is going to be called the Washington Naval Conference. And we are going to reach an agreement. And the agreement is complex, but let's go through it. The agreement was we're going to get rid of our naval armaments, basically our Navy weapons. Number one, ships from now on had to be smaller than 35,000 tons. So this would stop us from trying to build the biggest ships ever. And if they build a big ship, we're going to build a bigger one. This would stop the arms race. So number two, our ships have to have guns that are smaller than 16 inches. What that's basically saying, that's the diameter of the end of the gun, that our guns will be small enough and therefore can shoot less far. And therefore, we're not just trying to build bigger and badder guns that can shoot farther and be more militarily efficient. So, because that's what we do. If Japan builds a gun that can shoot further, then we're going to build a bigger gun. And so this stops that. Number three, no more naval bases. Keep what you have. You can't try to conquer anything else to grow and be more powerful. One more agreement of the Washington Naval Conference. It had to do with the total number of ships. We talked a lot about the size of new ships, but now the total number, the quantity, not quality. The proposal was that Japan, Britain, and the US all have an equal number of ships. Keep our navies the exact same. Britain was upset. They said, no, I do not want equality. Look at my empire. I have to watch 3 oceans. I can't be equal with these other countries. So Britain demanded more ships. US then complained and said, well, we have 2 oceans that we have to guard. We need a bigger navy too. So Japan only has 1 ocean that they have to patrol. So no, equality is not equity in this case. And so they strike an agreement, a compromise called 553. Basically, that would be the ratio. Britain and the U.S. would get 5 ships. Britain would have 5. The U.S. would have 5. Japan would get 3. And that would be the ratio that they would follow. Agreement. Now, this was like the first time ever that the strongest countries in the world strived and agreed to actually disarm, lower their strength, get rid of their weapons, not as part of a treaty after a war where they're under duress and forced to, but where they voluntarily agreed to do it. So much of the world rejoices, yes, wow, we're moving in the right direction. We will never have another war. And that made much of the world happy. That was the Washington Naval Conference, which absolutely the U.S. played a huge role in it. Less ships, less war. But there's a catch. The United States, after 20 years of no shipbuilding, absolutely got somewhat weak. And 20 years later, that weakness is going to encourage aggression at Pearl Harbor when Japan, who was secretly building up armaments in their Navy and violating the Washington Naval Conference's pact and treaty, is going to crush our Navy just pretty much with one attack. They never would have attempted that if we were significantly more strong. So the Washington Naval Conference was great and awesome. You could say that it prevented war by causing the powers of the world to not be in arms races. But you could also make the case that it caused the war by leading to weakness. And weakness encourages aggression. If people think they can take advantage of you, they will. Now, in 2020, or even the 1980s, we have the same discussion with nuclear weapons today. Everybody seems to want to get rid of nuclear weapons because they're dangerous, awful, and have the potential to kill. But when you have a nuclear weapon, as the Cold War kind of showed us, countries are not willing to attack you. So indirectly, it can almost lead to you creating, keeping nuclear weapons can almost lead to you maintaining peace, ironically and unexpectedly enough. The reason I have a picture of Donald Trump there is because there's a lot of concern about North Korea creating weapons. And of course, Donald Trump has been strongly connected with the negotiation process with North Korea, trying to get them to get rid of their weapons, come up with some type of treaty there. And of course, Obama before him. So Harding embraced laissez-faire economics, hands off the economy, supported isolationism, disarmament, wanting to get rid of weapons and so on. And Harding also embraced lowering taxes for the rich. Harding believed in lowering taxes. Now, this is going to anger progressives, but they're out of power, so what? Now, lowering those taxes helps the rich, is what progressives say, because at this time, we had a progressive income tax where the rich paid most of the income taxes. Now, and that's going to be true all the way up to World War II, but either way, taxes fund programs. When you kind of soak the rich or have high taxes on the rich, you take a lot of their money and you can fund people in need in a lot of programs. Lowering taxes, you can argue, hurts the poor because then you can't afford as many of those programs to support people in need. So progressives say high taxes are necessary. The poor in need help. But Harding would make the case that no, lowering taxes on the rich actually helps the poor, because when you lower taxes on the wealthy and on businesses, those businesses can reinvest all that money they're saving into more factories, making their businesses more efficient, which money certainly can do. More factories leads to more jobs, and that helps the economy, and those more jobs go to people that are poor and to the middle class. So Harding and the Republicans in the 1920s would argue that the best way to help the poor is to cut the taxes of the rich. So again, this is going to get a name in the late 1970s called the trickle-down theory, that the way to help the poor is basically to help the rich, and that money will trickle down or slowly help the poor by the creation of jobs and stimulating the economy. Now, Democrats, whether today or the 1980s or the 1920s, disagreed. Progressives were like, no, the trickle-down theory doesn't work. If you want to help the poor, help them directly with programs. A lot of times that money doesn't make it all the way to the bottom. If you pour that, basically that champagne on that top glass, it overpours, but maybe it stays with the wealthy or the upper middle class, doesn't make it all the way down to the poor. A rising tide does not necessarily lift all boats, is the theory. That said, do you favor, when the next time you vote, a candidate that prioritizes support for the poor directly or for businesses? Because if you have to prioritize one, there's only so much government money and support. Who gets the greater support? What's the best way to help your country as a whole? Direct support for the poor and those in need, or for businesses to stimulate them? So Harding, supported laissez-faire and isolationism and disarmament and lowering taxes, which mostly impacted the rich. But he also supported raising U.S. farm tariffs, which is a type of tax. So this would be an exception. In the 1920s, farmers were struggling mostly because during World War I, they planted more crops because our troops needed more food, and that helped farmers make more money. But the war ended, and they had so many crops left over, and we're still planting so much land that the prices of their food dropped. The floor came out of the bottom of that. So farmers started losing money, and when the war ended, they no longer needed to feed the entire world. So the solution that many of them came up with was, well, we're losing money. Let's plant even more crops. That way we'll sell more and we'll make up for the money we lost. Now that makes sense because that would make them wealthy, except supply and demand kind of intervened. When they planted more crops, it didn't change demand. People didn't need it. So it brought those prices even lower, which created a massive problem. Basically, after World War I, farmers were basically dropped into poverty because of this. So Harding decides to help, and he raises tariffs on foreign food. So foreign crop prices made by companies from around the world goes up in price because we say, hey, you're going to pay a tariff. If you want to sell your goods in the U.S., you're going to have to pay a huge tax, which raises those prices. American farmers now are like, yes, now our crops are the cheapest, and people are going to buy from us, and that helps us. So farmers are a little more happy because of these tariffs, but who got hurt? American consumers. Basically, all the food they wanted that were sold from everywhere around the world now massively went up in price, and that hurt Americans, consumers, absolutely. So what is your philosophy when it comes to tariffs? Are you going to vote for a political candidate that wants to lower tariffs? That's going to lead to lower prices in the country, and that helps consumers. But if you lower tariffs, then foreign goods are less expensive, and that hurts American companies. So, what do you want? Higher tariffs to protect American companies, or lower tariffs to lead to lower prices for everyone? It's tough. Now, to kind of expand on that issue, it wasn't just farm goods that Harding raised tariffs for. In 1922, the U.S. passed the Forde-McCumber Tariff Act, which raised the highest tariffs in the history of the United States, 60% tariffs on many industries across the U.S., including steel, oil. Now, a problem for this was Britain and France at this point owed the United States a massive amount of money. The U.S. basically funded their war with our loans, $10 billion worth. And now after the war, the U.S. is like, where's my money? I want it back. Pay us back. And the problem is, the way that Britain was paying it back was by selling lots of goods to those hungry, wealthy U.S. customers. But the moment that the U.S. put 60% tariffs on all foreign goods, now British and French goods were so expensive, no Americans were buying them, basically throwing Britain and France into bankruptcy. And how can they pay back America without any money from selling goods around the world? So instead, they go to Germany and say, pay me back the money you owe me from World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, all those reparations, all that money that Germany was forced to pay by the Treaty of Versailles. Problem is, Germany had no money, and they couldn't pay back those reparations. So in 1923, the French even invaded Germany because Germany was not paying back the reparations. It looked like a new war was going to happen. So the U.S. intervened in 1923 with what was known as the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan was the U.S. aggressively gave billions of dollars in loans to Germany. And Germany, now that it had that money, could pay back Britain and France those reparations. And Britain and France now, with that money from Germany, could pay back the loans they owed to the United States. Now so the United States basically is going to be paying the money that gets paid back to them. But in turn, this is going to save Germany's economy and save Britain and France's economy. And as their economies get stimulated by all this money, they're able to buy U.S. goods. So in a way, this is self-serving to the United States. It's actually good economic policy, giving money, helping countries get back on their feet, so that once they get back on their feet with their stimulated economies, America has so many customers that the U.S. can then buy their products. And of course, the U.S. back in the 1920s was the biggest producer of products, which means those countries, if they're economically healthy, can now buy our products. So in this case, giving loans to countries that are struggling, helping them getting on their feet, is going to be good economic policy. The Dawes Plan is a huge win for Harding. Now, that said, Britain and France are going to consider the U.S. very selfish, and relations with those two countries is going to strain a little bit because they wanted the U.S. just to forgive them of those $10 billion in loans. They felt that they did most of the fighting and dying in World War I. The U.S. showed up only in the last year, and that the U.S., it was a very small contribution, all that money, and we should just let it go, let them default. But the U.S. did not feel that way. So the next Harding policy was supporting the spoils system. Now, presidents, whoever they are, need help. They're not experts on everything, so they have a cabinet. Cabinet is the nickname for their advisors, the people that run their departments. But Harding had a problem with his cabinet. He basically, as a politician, to get elected, because getting elected to be president is super expensive, one solution to get elected president is to get people's support that can help you get elected. Now, you have to offer them something. So, and a big thing that you often offer is, hey, you give me your support, you help me raise money to get elected, I will make you a cabinet member, I'll give you a post. Now, usually this isn't done publicly, right? Because the optics of it don't sound good. But this is called the spoils system. Basically, when you win, you fire everybody and then you replace them with the people that helped you get elected. Now, the spoils system is bad because the best people don't get the jobs. But the not qualified people, the people that helped you get elected, get those jobs. They get hired. So we have a lot of important people running our government that aren't necessarily the best people for those positions. Harding is a good example. Harding's appointments were nicknamed the Ohio Gang because they were a lot of his poker buddies back from when he served in Ohio. Now, the Ohio Gang is going to get him into trouble. Let's see how. In 1920, Japan was getting stronger and stronger, and the United States was getting worried that if war did, in fact, break out with them, it would be a huge war in the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean's huge and gigantic, and it would be a big war, right? So basically, at that point, if we're going to cover all of the Pacific Ocean, we need ships. And our ships need lots of oil. And where could the United States find oil? But in the state of Wyoming. Now, there was a town in Wyoming called Teapot Dome, and that town is going to have oil underneath it. The U.S. government, to prepare for this possible war, is going to need to hire a company to get the oil out of the ground. Tons of companies were interested. So under the law, the U.S. has to allow all of them to bid for the project. So basically, whose job is it to bid these companies out? It's the cabinet member under Harding, the Secretary of Interior. His name is Albert Fall. Albert Fall works for Warren G. Harding in his cabinet, and the bidding process doesn't happen. There's no bidding. He awards the contract to a random company. And why does he do that? Because he gets a kickback. Basically, that company bribes him secretly. Now, what is Albert Fall's motivation? Well, basically, that company hooked him up with $260,000 of Liberty bonds. And another company lent him $100,000 with no expectation of him ever paying it back. But it was basically sold as a bribe. So basically, he's going to get caught. How does Albert Fall get caught? Somebody saw him with a bunch of $100 bills, which was unbelievably unique for the time. He wasn't a wealthy person, but clearly he got the money somehow. Somebody also overheard him saying that he had heard the company, a leader in the company said that they had paid him Albert Fall $68,000 to Albert Fall. Now later, when this company was caught, they testified and said, no, I didn't say I paid him $8,000. I said I had sent 6 or 8 cows to his ranch. So another law. Either way, Albert Fall caught, went to prison for a year. Now, Albert Fall's boss was Warren G. Harding, and everybody's like, he was in on it. He must have got some of the money. He was behind it. He was Albert Fall's boss. He must have known about it. Now, the name of the scandal is called the Teapot Dome scandal, named after the place where they got the oil. Now, this political cartoon is basically saying the Teapot Dome is coming for the White House. It took down Albert Fall. It's now coming to Warren G. Harding. What did he know about it? Well, either way, Harding is going to die before any proof could be ascertained or found that he was in on it. But that said, there was another scandal that plagued Harding's administration. Scandal number 2. Harry Doherty was also in Harding's cabinet as Attorney General. That means he's in charge of enforcing the law, the top cop, essentially. Harry Doherty, again, was hiring for the Justice Department, which he was in charge of, and he took bribes to hire people. So that's going to be out there. Once again, did Harding, was he in on it? We just don't know. Scandal number 3, presidents are allowed to pardon people, and the Justice Department works with the president to figure out who should be pardoned. Once again, Harry Doherty accepted bribes to get Warren G. Harding to pardon people, to let them out of prison. A pardon is when you've committed a crime and you've been convicted. And if a governor or president grants you a pardon, they have forgiven you for your crime, you get to go free no matter what you've done. Scandal number 4, in 1920, World War I was over, but there were lots of wounded Americans, and they needed the services of hospitals once they got back to the U.S. Charles Forbes, which wasn't in the President Harding's cabinet, but he did work for the Secretary of the Interior under the Veterans Affairs. So once again, Charles Forbes ran the Veterans Bureau, which indirectly worked for Harding, and they needed to build a ton of hospitals, right, for these World War I veterans that were coming home. Now, Charles Forbes used government money to hire Charles Hurley. And Charles Hurley had a construction company, and Hurley overcharged Forbes or the Veterans Bureau or the U.S. government $3,000 to $4,000. Now, to build these hospitals, he charged $3,000 to $4,000 per bed. And now that's not how much it costs to build these beds. So basically, it was an example of Hurley overcharging the Harding's administration, and the government actually paying for it. So clearly they were in on it. Hurley kicked back money to them. Scandal number 5 under the Harding administration was again Charles Forbes. During World War I, veterans were hurt, and the government ordered millions of hospital supplies, but the veterans never got them. Forbes actually sold them on the black market and pocketed that money, and the government had to buy more supplies to give to these veterans. Forbes got wealthy and then, of course, also got jail appropriately. So Harding famously said, "I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies. But my friends, my goddamn friends, they're the only ones who keep me walking the floors at night." And that is true. Now, who is getting angry at Harding? Well, the whole country, all these scandals. He goes down as the most scandalous of presidents. Now, in June of 1923, trying to get away from Washington, D.C. and all of these scandals, Harding took off for Alaska. He went for a hunting trip. And on that trip, he had a heart attack. Some people say all the stress from the scandals caused it. Other people said there were other reasons. Either way, he had a heart attack and he passed on. Now, who was his vice president? That would be Calvin Coolidge. And Calvin Coolidge is going to then get sworn in as vice president and later be elected as president in his own right. So in conclusion, presidential rankings go. The Teapot Dome scandal and all those other scandals are going to drop Warren G. Harding. Some people put him generally last, but almost everybody puts him near the bottom of presidential rankings, saying that he was among the worst. He did preside over a time of great prosperity, the building of great prosperity. That's why some people put him a little bit higher, but usually right at the bottom. So again, very sad for Harding, but it is what it is. So this was a presentation on Warren G. Harding, his presidency, and his times. Please look in Google Classroom for your assignment.